Thank you. Great. We're down to the bitter end here, the hardcore. So I thank you all for staying. Thank the organizers for inviting me. It's been, parts of it have been a lot of fun, and I've learnt some things that are going to be integrated into some of what I want to talk about. And here's what I'm going to talk about. Incidentally, I only partially agree with this, but I do think that the paradigms that have been developed up to now, which have not included complexity, have of course been used more than metaphorically, but in terms of a mindset to discuss the error of time. I mean, and beginning with the concept of entropy and the idea of some a theoretical framework where we can write down an equation and we believe that that is true for all time and is something that has predictive power to arbitrary accuracy. It's kind of the Newtonian view. And it may be that as we come to address more and more questions of complexity, our whole paradigm will shift in terms of the way we think about the early universe and the question of time. And I will integrate this as I go along. But really this is the question I'm going to be addressing, is how in living systems a new time, a new universal time emerges, and that universal time comes ultimately from network kinds of problems. And I'm not going to discuss this is just a laundry list of the kinds of properties that complex systems have. And the one that I'm most interested in, and I'm going to talk about, is this, that there might be underlying simplicity despite all of these myriad problems and characteristics associated with typical complex adaptive systems. And when we start thinking about life in all its manifestations, I think we immediately reject this idea that there are kind of Newton's laws of living systems because of complexity, that is not the framework that we can really start to develop a serious theory of complexity in dealing with life, as I say, in all its manifestations. But on the other hand, it is conceivable that there are kind of coarse-grained descriptions, kind of average descriptions, so that I got given a couple of physics examples, kind of toy model things that capture essential features, so that in the last example there, longevity, to be able to explain why all of us in this room will be dead within 100 years. Most of us will be dead within the next 10 or 15 years, but the human lifespan is of the order of 100 years. We ought to be able to predict that from fundamental ideas in biology, whereas, of course, there is no way in which we can predict the lifespan of a particular individual. Here's another example. This is a forest. You're very familiar with this kind of thing. You walk through it, and it looks like this kind of random distribution of plants and trees and and so forth. What I'm going to tell you is this has extraordinary regularity. No matter where you look on the planet, whatever forest you look at, if you actually look at the measurable quantities and you ask questions like, how many trees are there of a given size? What is their distribution in space? How many leaves does each branch have? How big is the canopy? How much energy is flowing through each branch? Anything you can think of that can be quantified, there is a mathematical, principled, physics-based framework that answers that with a bunch of formulae, which I'm not going to show you, that can answer all of those questions on the average. And I'm also not going to show you in this talk the multiple data sets that verify those predictions. I'm going to show you others in other systems. So this is a complex system, highly complex adaptive system, and time comes into it because this has to grow, things grow and they die. And I will talk a little bit about that in a moment. And one of the questions I do want to address is, can we do the same for this? Is this just another version of this? It's another complex system. It's of course driven by this, it metabolizes, and needless to say, because it metabolizes, it has to be driven not just, and it's a socioeconomic system, it's not just energy, but it's driven by the economy. And the economy, we heard someone say, time is money, which indeed it is. And the first thing that you notice is this is the time by which all of us live, and this is a fractal time, something that hasn't come up in this. The time actually we live by, which is determined by the socioeconomic bath that we live in, is actually fractal-like. Now, this continuous open growth is endemic to all socioeconomic systems, and I'm going to come back to this in a moment and talk about whether this is sustainable and whether there's a finite lifetime to these kinds of systems. But one of the first things I want to talk about is entropy. This is socioeconomic entropy. This also has time involved, and this is, I hate to say this, I know this is a bit platitudinous, this is time. This is time, and this is entropy. It is extraordinary, to my mind, that trying to understand where all this shit comes from has led to the one explanation we might have for the arrow of time from the beginnings of the universe. It's kind of amazing that this, trying to deal with this, pollution, the running of engines and so on, has led to this extraordinary concept. And so I actually believe that when we come to terms with complexity in the grand scale, I actually think it will play a serious role in understanding the origins of the universe and time. It's completely contrary to the usual way of thinking, and it's completely contrary to everything I believed in doing high-energy physics for 40 years. That's also entropy, as is that. That's the result of entropy. Okay, so here's a couple of questions that drive me. One I've already mentioned, a citizen company is just a large organism satisfying laws of biology. Is Microsoft a great big whale? Is Copenhagen an elephant? And if that's so, how come companies die, thinking of time? They have a finite lifespan, but you know almost all cities survive. Cities that you can think of course, classic examples of the millions and millions of communities or cities survive. You can drop an atom bomb on a city and 30 years later it's fine. Drop a small bomb on Google, it will have a hard time recovering. So this I've already said, and this is the last piece of introductory information is to recognize that we live in an exponentially expanding socioeconomic universe. And just to give you an illustration, I have some numbers here, just one simple number, and that's about the growth of cities. 200 years ago, 3 to 4% of the United States was non-urban. Today it's 82%. The world crossed the halfway mark 2 or 3 years ago. China is building about 300 to 400 new cities in excess of 1 million in the next 25 to 30 years. And that number down there is truly extraordinary. On the average, between now and 2050, 1 million people a week are going to be urbanized. And this is all time. This is happening in time, and we're in this expanding universe, and I'm going to jump way ahead. This is simply not sustainable. And anyone in this room that's, you know, in kind of mid-career or young is going to be totally affected by this phenomenon. The drain on resources and the speeding up of time is going to have a very profound effect, and I want to get to that very quickly. So one of the first things you recognize about life in the large is that it's extraordinarily resilient and extraordinarily scalable. It's been around for several billion years. Mammals themselves cover 8 orders of magnitude. They work in the same way, the same physics, chemistry, organization, and the way they metabolize, the way they use information is pretty much the same across them. But in fact, if you go from the things we've heard about, the production of ATP, all the way through mitochondria and cells to produce macroscopic multicellular organisms, which themselves produce artifacts and abodes, all of this, in order for it to be resilient and to last over, in some cases, billions of years, in other cases tens of thousands of years, cannot be arbitrary and simply stochastic. There have to be emergent laws on an average level for these to obey and to remain resilient and to be scalable over the extraordinary scale. This scale from there to there is like 40 orders of magnitude. And in fact, one way of thinking of this is that this and all of this exists beginning with this process. That's the transformational process of which we're all undergoing. And these are some of the phenomena to do with time, with biology, and this theoretical framework, which I'm going to tell you shortly, that talked about the forest and understanding in a quantitative framework applies to all of these things. And I'm not going to talk about them except one or two places, but understanding our lifespan, understanding why we sleep for 8 hours and not 2 hours, like a whale does, or 15 hours like a mouse, etc., etc. And I would touch on some of these. And here's the point about scalability. This is the most, to my mind, an extraordinary graph. It's been known for a very long time. What it is, it plots the most fundamental quantity in biology, metabolic rate, how much energy you need per second to stay alive, against body mass. And what you see on a log-log plot is this ridiculously simple straight line, which is extraordinary because this is the most diverse and complex system in the universe. Each one of these organisms, each component of that organism, each cell type has evolved with its own unique history by natural selection. You would have thought, given all that, these would end up all over the map, representing that historical contingency. What you see is this ridiculous straight line, and that straight line has another amazing property. It has a slope less than 1, a slope very close to 3/4, which means that there is an economy of scale the bigger you are. If you double the size, you would have expected to have doubled the amount of power you need to stay alive. You don't. There's a systematic economy of scale. And here it goes all the way down to the molecules. That's the same line to this production of ATP here. So here it is, this ridiculously simple law. But in fact, if you look at any physiological quantity or any life history event, you've seen the same kind of simple scaling. Here's some mundane data for the radius of the aorta. Scaling is 3/8, the same as tree trunks. There's body length, scales very close to 1/4. That's heart rate, decreasing as mass to the 1/4. There's lifespan, increasing as mass to the 1/4, which means if you multiply that by that, there it is, you get an invariant. The number of heartbeats in a lifespan is the same whether you're a diddly little shrew sitting on the palm of my hand or a great big fucking whale that's bigger than this building. Each of them has about a 1.5 billion heartbeats. Now, there's nothing fundamental about hearts, obviously. What there is something fundamental about is the number of times you produce this infamous ATP. And that is an approximate invariant across aerobic metabolism. I've written it up there. This is the heartbeats. So there's something extraordinary about time. Time we measure by beating. So it's kind of weird. Maybe the shrew that lives for a year or so versus the whale that lives 150 years somehow experientially have the same lifespan. A year for a shrew is not the same as a year for us. So there's a kind of weird contraction. Okay, all kinds of things scale. I put this one in because we've had some neurology. This is white matter to gray matter in the brain. This is about 5/4. Here's genome length, 1/4. And what you see is the ubiquity of this number 1/4, this universality that spreads across the entire spectrum of biology from the subcellular level to the ecosystem level. And it is one of the few places where you have these kind of quantitative laws, and the reason, where in the hell do they come from? And the idea is they are manifestations of the universal generic properties of the networks that sustain life. Life is sustained in this picture by networks, whether they're intracellular transport networks or some mundane things like your circulatory system or your neural system for that matter, or your bones. All of these are network systems, and it is those properties. And I've just written down here some of the proposals that we made for the fundamental constraints on these networks, which I am not going to discuss. All I can say is that they have to be put into a mathematical framework. The first one is space filling. The last one is to do with optimization, so that, for example, we have evolved so that in our circuitry system we minimize the amount of dissipation so that we can use more energy to reproduce. Fitness, it increases our fitness by minimizing dissipation. So you have to take these principles and take these networks and put them in the mathematical framework, and I'll just say tangentially that framework is effectively one of field theory and using Euler-Lagrange equations to get what are effectively the equations of motion, if you like, for these networks, and therefore determining the minimum in terms of the multiple variations that you can make on the network. The ones that have evolved on the average that we, meaning all mammals, have are determined by those equations. And so that here's just pictures of networks, just to give you a flash through. You're familiar with them. Maybe not that. That's a little thing that lives inside an elephant. That's a mitochondrial network. That's within cells. That's networks within mitochondria, and so on. Now here's just one amusing point. When you work all this out, and I'm not giving you any technicalities, you have to believe it, work all this out, what you find is that the metabolic rate in D, I came from high energy physics, so I work in D dimensions. Here's the answer. The answer is, in D dimensions, metabolic rate scales as D over D plus 1. So 4 is not 4. 4 is 3 plus 1. It's the dimensionality of space you live in plus 1. That 1, loosely hand-waving speaking, is derived from the fractality, the self-similar behavior of these networks, so that in this picture, life is actually 5-dimensional. 3 space, 1 fractal, and then time. Kind of amazing, actually. So that's one way of thinking about it that relates it to all the bullshit that we've heard about multi-universes and extra dimensions and so on. This is it. Okay, so I'm just flashing on here a bunch of tables showing you predictions versus observed. You can work everything out. I'm showing you the result of 10 years or more work. And you can see all kinds of weird things you can calculate. Density of capillaries, oxygen affinity. Look, this is the exponent, minus 1/12, and ridiculously, it's in very close agreement. I think that's an accident, but it shows you that in this average way, we've got a pretty good description of a lot of these things. So that's the circulatory system. This is the respiratory system. This is for plants and trees. And again, I'm not going to bore you with this. This is for a whole forest. That's the one I talked about at the beginning, and so on. And I just want to convince you that we have a theoretical framework with, 200 predictions which agree with data, and predictions made of data that did not exist before this work was done. I want to now spend a minute or two about growth, because that involves time. So here's you changed, and there is what you look like in your growth curve. It happens to be a rat, but weight versus age, and the same theory that does the circulatory system and the forest predicts that line. That's actually a prediction, and those dots are data points. And here's the theory in words. What do? You eat, you metabolize, that energy goes distributed through networks. Some maintain cells that are already there, including replacing dead ones, and it grows new cells. There's the equations. I'm not going to show you. You can solve them. Here's what's beautiful, and you don't have to believe any of the theory. The theory tells you to plot it in this Byzantine way, the mass at age t relative to the mature mass to the quarter power versus this Byzantine variable, and the a in it and in those equations are universal numbers like mass of cell, energy to make a cell. They're all buried in here. And what it says is if you do plot it this way, everybody grows in the same way. There it is. That's just a bunch that we got together. Everybody's growing in the same way. There is a kind of spiritual beauty to the unity of life, and whether or not you believe in the great designer. So this is the same theory applied to social networks, not social networks, social insects. It's the same thing, and these are done by some ex-postdocs of mine. And we did some recently on cancer, which is a very complicated thing to do. But this was taken from, that blue line is predicted from the theory, and some people at Harvard Oncology put all this together. So here's the point. Network geometry and dynamics control the pace of life at all scales, leading to an emergent universal time. And I want to show you more explicitly how that is. And here it is. This just comes from the network. All rates decreases mass to the -1/4. All of these things. And you see there's huge time differences between evolutionary rates, meaning by evolution I mean DNA substitution rates, DNA nucleotide substitution rates, all the way to longevity, and all times increase by mass to the 1/4. The pace of life systematically slows, and I've added here temperature because everything sits in a temperature bath, so this is the environmental temperature. So you futz around with the statistical mechanics, and roughly speaking, it does what you might not be surprised to see. It brings in a Boltzmann factor. So what this says is, if I take times and I correct, in quotes, for the mass and temperature dependence, or I take rates and do likewise, everything lives in the same rate. There is a universal time, and it is governed simply by two numbers, 1/4, which comes from the networks, and the number 0.7, which is a rough number that is this E, this kind of average activation energy for the chemical reactions producing ATP. So there is this kind of universal rate of living. Everybody dies, grows, reproduces, evolves at the same rate if you do the appropriate corrections. And more important, on what I showed you earlier on longevity, rates times time are invariant. So there's lots of invariance. Okay, I'm missing this. This is showing you the data, but you have to believe me. So here we have this little summary in biology. It's dominated by these extraordinary scaling laws. There's this marvelous economy of scale. The bigger you are, the less energy you need per cell, for example. You slow down systematically, and you grow in a sigmoidal fashion, and you stop growing, and you do not evolve during your lifespan. You stop growing. And all of this is governed by networks, and this is extraordinarily sustainable because of that. These are the people I work with. Jim Brown is a fantastic ecologist. These are the people I work with on the next part, which I'm going to finish off very shortly about. But you can see, I just want to show you all this is a motley crew, and it's the first two guys that have really done all the work, and the rest of increasing stature did less and less and just bullshitted, and they would have done well at this meeting. So here's a bunch of papers for those interested. Almost all the papers, there's a whole bunch of them. There's more. There's a bunch of papers in Nature and Science and PNAS. Those that are interested in the next part, there's also a Nature paper about 6 months ago, and in this, someone mentioned Scientific American. This month's Scientific American, there's an article about what I'm going to talk about now, and I'm going to finish up very quickly. That is, can we take this whole paradigm into the socioeconomic sphere? So the first thing is, do cities scale? So what did this tell us in biology? It said that, you know, the whale living in the ocean and the elephant's trunk and the giraffe's neck and us walking on 2 feet, are actually just icing on the cake, so to speak, But at the 85, 90% level, you tell me the size of a mammal, I can tell you pretty much everything about its physiology and life history and the structure of its networks. Is that the same about cities? Is New York just a scaled up San Francisco, which is a scaled up Santa Fe, even though they're completely different looking and they have different histories and so on? And the only way, and one is motivated, the answer might be yes, because cities are, of course, networks. The most important of which we've already heard about is this, social networks, because cities are a physical manifestation of what we're doing here and we do universally, that is talk to one another and form clusters and groups from families and jobs and so on. So the first work I did on this was ask a very simple question about gas stations. How many gas stations are there as a function of size of cities? And what you see is lovely scaling, but you see it's just like biology. It's sublinear. That exponent is about 0.85, and it's universal. It's the same here, and we've looked at countries all over the world. It's the same everywhere. More to the point is we've looked at all infrastructure, length of roads, you name it, anything. It's the same. Looks just like this. It scales in the same way. The economy of scale is the same no matter what metric you look at. You have the same savings per capita, the bigger you are, on the length of roads, the number of gas stations, and length of electrical lines, whether you are in Portugal, Peru, or Copenhagen, Denmark. It's universal. But these are mundane quantities. This is just the buildings and roads and so on. Here's what's really important, is the socioeconomic things like wages and people like you lot, super creative. And what you see here is the scaling of that. That's plotted wages versus population, log plot. And you see lovely scaling. Of course, there's lots of fluctuations. But the exponent here is bigger than 1. And this has enormous consequences. And I want to just end up by telling you about those. But first, let me just say a couple of words about this. This exponent is a universal exponent. We are struggling with trying to calculate it. It's the analog to the quarter. Namely, if you look at this, you plot these, and quantities like this, that's the number of patents produced. That slope is also, I should have written on it, 1.15. Police protection, taxes, construction, crime. You always get an exponent that is pretty much the same. And it's the same no matter where you look. Japan, Chile, England, doesn't matter. United States, it's universal, even though these cities had evolved and grew completely independent of one another. Obviously, something universal is going on, and, there we just showed, this was cute. We put all of these we put income, GDP for the city, crime, and patents on one graph. And you can see that there's a universality. So I'm going to miss this out. But here's one of the most important points is, if you have superlinear behavior, meaning more per capita, meaning the exponent is bigger than 1, and it's governed by networks, then contrary to biology where the pace of life slows down, the pace of life speeds up. The bigger you are, everything goes faster, and we've looked at lots of data. This is a whimsical piece of data. This is biology. That's the modern data on the heart rate. You see the quarter power up there. This is walking speed in cities. And the prediction actually is not quite as good as I'd hoped it would be, but you can see there's definitely a scaling effect in the right direction. So I will miss this out. Here's the reason we believe that it's of the universality. It is the universal properties of the universal social networks of human interaction. And that is that the way we cluster, the way we form families, the way we interact is a universal phenomenon to do with the fact that we are human beings, and the cultural aspects are like that extra 5 or 10%. So this says that if you tell me the size of a city in the United States, I can tell you pretty much at the 85% level everything about it, how many police it should have, how many crimes, how many patents it produces, and so on. So this has extraordinary consequences for sustainability, and because it says that all of these phenomena, which we often think of as different, from global warming to the environment to financial markets to crime and so on, are actually all interacting, and they are all complex adaptive systems, and together they form a grouping of complex adaptive systems. And so to address sustainability, we need, again, a whimsical statement, a grand unified theory, a matrix with all these, and recognizing their coupling. Okay, so I'm going to finish off by talking about growth and how this propagates through, this superlinear propagates through to understanding growth of socioeconomic systems and the pitfalls that they have. So it's the same equation. I've taken all the bells and whistles off, but it's the same equation. You have resources, you appropriate them to maintenance and to growth, and you can write down the equations and you can solve them. The only difference I've done here is that there's a beta in the problem, which is the exponent, which was less than 1 in biology and bigger than 1 in socioeconomic systems. And this equation is an extraordinary equation, and many of you will recognize it in different contexts. It's extraordinary because it has a phase transition at beta equals 1. So something is different between whether something is less than 1 or greater than 1. And it has a finite time singularity when beta is greater than 1. And I'm going to show you what that means. So here's beta less than 1. That should have been a beta, sorry about that. And this is what we saw, sigmoidal bounded growth, beautiful. That's us. That's why we've been around for a very long time, and we will remain around if it weren't for the fact that we have invented a socioeconomic system that has beta greater than 1 and which has a finite time singularity. And incidentally, I should have said, in our conventional wisdom is that this might be good for us, but it's really shitty if you are an economy. This is totally against growth. Cities and economies must grow in the paradigm that we have evolved. And this is very good because at first sight, because when beta is greater than 1, we don't get sigmoidal. You get actually super exponential growth, but there is a finite time singularity, and you hit that eventually, and you collapse. And you hit that, and you can relate it to the breakdown of resources. So how do we avoid this? Well, we avoid it because this growth was, of course, derived within a certain paradigm. Coal has changed the culture. Or Stone Age, stone, people discover how to use stone. Or IT. Something sets the culture and sets the boundary conditions for this. So one way of avoiding this is, as you go up here, as you're approaching the singularity, you better make a major change, you better make a major innovation. That's what it says. So you can start over again. But of course, you're going to hit another finite time singularity, so you better innovate again, and so on. So there's a theorem, actually, when you put it all the mathematics together, there's a theorem. If you demand continuous growth, the kind of socioeconomic system that has given us all this, that has built all of this, and allowed us, may I say, to think about the origins of time and the arrow of time, we could not do this if it weren't for this. We wouldn't be here. So there was that funny, also bullshitty talk about Eddington that had this wonderful thing in it about him talking about, it was you? No. You don't bullshit. That's why I was not, that has this marvelous thing that he talks, it was my interpretation, of somehow, who we are here and how we're constructed affects the way we think about time and what is time. And I think we should recognize that we need this to be here to think about time. However, here's the catch. I said already, as you grow on here, the pace of life gets faster. That's bad enough. But at some stage, you've got to make these innovations, and the theory says the time to go from here to here is systematically bigger than from here to here, which is systematically bigger than here to here, so that socioeconomic time, the time we actually live by, not this bloody thing, but the time we live by is accelerating relative to the time defined by the Earth going around the sun, the usual time. So that there is an acceleration, and I forgot to, I just realized I didn't have, I had the equation down here, but that was this T, somehow I got lost. Sorry about that. But there's a very simple equation that tells you the relationship between, quote, real time and socioeconomic time. This is real time, actually. This is real time. This is the time you live by, because it is the time that you feel, that you're forced to feel by the socioeconomic system to which you have bought into. So what it says is that we are on this treadmill, but this treadmill is continuously accelerating, and we have to jump at various times to another treadmill that is accelerating even faster. So that something that took 1,000 years to develop, say 10,000 years ago, now takes 20 years, and so forth. So these things are getting shorter and shorter. This is clearly not sustainable. At least I don't think so. And it's all to avoid this finite time singularity. So there's a man named Ray Kurzweil, whom some of you may have heard of, and he doesn't do mathematics, but he got turned on to a version of this, not mine. I mean, this is, I came to this as a physicist, so it has a little teeny weeny bit of rigor. This does not, the ideas that he uses may be very profound, but he came to it via just the usual qualitative bullshit. But one of the great things that he did was to put together a bunch of data. This part is bullshit, but this is interesting, because this is the stuff that, I don't believe the biology part. But you see, and what he's plotted is the paradigm shift in time versus the real time, and it turns out the slope of this, I wish I'd had that formula, is exactly a straight line on this plot with that slope. And there's another way of looking at it here. I'm going to do one last this thing, which is someone else, I forget who did this. These are not mine. It's the time to the next event, meaning the next major innovation versus time before the present. And what you can see, of course, is everything piling up, which is what you feel and what those equations tell you. And those equations tell you how quickly they pile up. So what about companies? Well, it turns out, to our amazement, when we looked at the data, I'm just showing you a teeny weeny bit. We've looked at 25,000 companies. This is just a teeny bit. They scale rather well. And this is income and assets for a bunch of companies versus the number of employees. And they scale very well, but they scale sublinearly, like biology. So if you took it over naively, you would say, gee whiz, that's interesting. If they're like biology, then, of course, they have to stop growing, and they die, okay? So, which is surprising, because you always get this image that companies, you know, there's Google and Yahoo, well, not so Yahoo, I guess, but Google, you know, all these companies are zooming away like this. Walmart, there it is, Walmart, zoomed, hockey stick. Well, we took the theory and we did this. First of all, this only goes up, I cheated, I only went to 1994. If you take to 2010, that is the theory, that red line. Okay, and that's the data, the present day. You can see it's bending over, and it's going to asymptote, and Walmart will eventually die, as will all companies. This is 23,000 companies. It's the Googles. Google is on here somewhere, and it's going crazy. But they all end up, like all of you, in the grave. Okay, so one of the challenges of this, in terms of time, is can we predict when Google is going to go bust, or Microsoft, which sounds impossible at the moment. But you know, what? Armageddon. Okay, so I have a couple of quotes, but I got one quote I will read here. I found, which is kind of extraordinary, I think. I don't know where he got it. He's a very smart guy. The ever-accelerating progress of technology gives the appearance of approaching some essential singularity in the history of the race beyond which human affairs as we know them could not continue, and therefore, this is me, Geoffrey West, adding, we could not think about time. Couldn't have this discussion if this is true. So we better come to terms with it, is the message. So time, this is real time, not necessarily the time of the universe, but that time of the universe is in here. So, okay. Thank you.